and special thanks to the commentators who took the time to read the book and to reflect on it. And so I have very little else to say other than that. Cette session aura lieu en anglais et en français. Nous sommes très heureuses de cet déroulement. Et donc, sentez-vous à l'aise de suivre via le chat. Je vais tenter d'écrire une version en anglais de la présentation qui aura lieu en français. So I will, in the chat function, try to type out an English version of what's being said, a synthetic version of what's being said in French. All right, so thank you all very much. I'm going to propose the following order in light of some of the technical challenges we had, to start with Leah Vosko, then go to Rani, then go to Louise Boivin, and then Ana Virginia Moreira Gomes. So thanks to each of you, and I will say no more. I'll just ask each of you to say a brief introduction about yourselves before you start to speak. Each speaker has about 15 minutes, and then we have some time for questions. So merci à tous. Leah.
What an honor to be first. All right, so it is my great pleasure to have the opportunity to reflect on Adelle's new book. I view Everyday Transgressions, Domestic Workers' Transnational Challenges to International Labor Law to be both a standout example of her in-depth knowledge of the history and evolution of international labor standard setting on domestic work, and a model of scholarship advancing global social justice, displaying Adelle's remarkable capacity to produce rigorous, timely research in the public interest. Preparing something this short on a subject that's very important is always difficult, and my task is made more difficult by the many contributions that this book makes. So I will still, nevertheless, restrain myself and talk principally about three contributions of Everyday Transgressions, speaking to the nature of the conversations to which the book contributes and the traditions it takes up and also subverts. And I'll try to do so as someone, and I think this is what Adelle wanted me to do, that has written a little bit about gender, citizenship, and the international regulation of precarious employment.
So Leah, sorry, if you don't mind just me interrupting super quickly. It sounds like there might be like your microphone might be close to some, like a fan or something, and it is a little bit hard to hear you. So if it's possible, just the microphone.
There's no fan.
It might just be the computer. Again, if you can't fix it,
yeah, it might be the computer. I was on an ILERA session starting at 7:30 this morning, and so my computer has been going for a while. Can you hear me all right, folks?
That's a lot better. Yes,
I'll try to sit a little bit closer, and I'm sorry if you don't see my face so well. So as I said, I'll talk about three contributions, and these contributions are one, making visible the coexistence of subordination and servitude in the household workplace, two, challenging methodological nationalism, and three, highlighting the transformative potential of transnational labor regulation through a global socio-legality. So making visible is the first point, that is the coexistence of subordination and servitude in the household workplace. Arguably, the foremost contribution of Everyday Transgressions is how it makes visible the law of the household workplace. To make the case for this endeavor, chapter 2, What's Our Informality Got to Do with It, on invisibility. In that chapter, Adelle critiques the development of formal labor codes in developing countries, a tactic used by the ILO technical experts and academics alike. And she shows how this approach is futile if it fails to account for actual work relations in the informal economy, and notes the general application of formal labor codes can be meaningless for many workers in need of protection, domestic workers being a case in point. At the same time, she's very careful to criticize customary law for recreating a racialized hierarchy. So the informal economy for Adelle is not shaped by a customary or outdated law. Rather, it sits on the same spectrum as the formal economy, treating the informal economy as though it is, and here I quote Adelle, synonymous with a lack of order, end quote, or an aberration, fails to make visible informal laws, including the laws of the household workplace. It effectively leaves in place, as Adelle puts it, the, quote, system of meaning that makes it seem natural for historically subordinated groups to continue to perform domestic work in the growing tertiary or service economy. So the exclusionary effects of the general application of regulatory measures is a topic of study that Adelle and I share in common. And in 2010, I wrote a book called Managing the Margins. And in that book, I tried to demonstrate the exclusionary effects of assuming a full-time, full-year job, complete with benefits, often talked about as a standard employment relationship as the norm, in the construction of regulations on non-standard forms of employment, very much perpetuated many of the problems that we see. And so I suggested that SCR centrism, as I called it in the book, contributes to the following pattern. The greater the deviation from the full-time permanent job, the lesser the protection such regulations provide. Workers most in need of protection are least likely their situations are least likely to be addressed and are most likely to be left out, many of whom are women, people of color, and migrant workers. So for Adelle, making visible the law of the household workplace is central to rectifying the exclusionary effects of such laws of general application, as it entails recognizing how subordination, and I think this is a very important contribution, and servitude operate simultaneously in this domain. In chapter 3, where Adelle addresses subordination or servitude in the law of the household workplace, through an analysis of seven post-1979 ethnographies, she shows how, on account of the law of the household workplace, domestic work is both work, and I love this quotation, like any other, and work like no other. In doing so, she underlines the uneasy, as she speaks of it, coexistence between status and contract, by reference to the fraught intimacy in domestic work, wherein the employer's recognition works to erase workers' subjectivity, while at the same time placing her in a position of servitude. This undertaking, which involves probing the links between slavery and employment, under-addressed in scholarly literature, and is, in my view, really path-breaking, in apprehending the centrality of processes of racialization to the persistence of servitude in that domain. At the same time, beyond the academy, in the everyday worlds of domestic workers, it's vital that identifying the possibilities and especially the limitations of international regulations doesn't result in misrecognition. That is to say that the regulatory recognition of domestic workers as workers deserving of labor protection and decent work should challenge deeply unjust formal and informal law and resist solidifying domestic workers' deeply gendered and racialized status. And so that is, in terms of the first contribution, I feel this is very important. Now, this takes me to the second major contribution of everyday transgressions that I want to talk about. And that is Adelle's rejection of methodological nationalism, not only as a scholarly practice, but at the level of international regulation. And again, this is a concern I share and we have had much dialogue on over the years. And from my own perspective, just to locate myself, I too have challenged the ILO and EU and indeed UN regulations for treating the nation state as Wimmer and Schiller talk about it, as a natural social political form of the modern world. So such methodological nationalism limits the analytic focus to boundaries of nation states with the effect of making a category of practice, that is the nation state, the category of analysis. And so I suppose the two of us kind of share an attempt to show how certain kinds of instruments, methodologically nationalist tendencies, can reinscribe hierarchies of citizenship qua nationality by allowing for multiple exclusions on such bases as race and also gender, and reinforce racialized capitalism in the process. So in this book, Adelle takes challenges to methodological nationalism to another level, in my view. First, by considering the law in action, specifically by contending that the actual, that is the everyday, law of the household workplace needs close analytical attention rather than only formal national laws governing domestic work. So she shows that the law of the household workplace is both transnational and colonial, building on the work of Eve Darian Smith, who contends that, and here I quote, legal constructions of race and the shifting practices of domestic racism have always overflowed boundaries of national jurisdictions and been constitutively shaped. And Adelle cites Darian Smith at length in this segment. For this reason, according to Adelle, the common sense way in which the domestic work relationship is understood and regulated is part of a global legacy of subordination and servitude that operates in particular places and in particular ways on particular women's bodies. Regarding the second different but related point of how, together, nation-state sovereignty and public-private divisions frustrate the pursuit of domestic workers' rights at the level of national labor law. In Chapter 3 in particular, Adelle shows how state law prevents domestic workers from exercising mobility and autonomy insofar as domestic work is considered beyond the nation-state's legislative reach. And we see this so much today in the face of the crises that are happening around COVID-19 and the immobility of domestic workers who are providing essential services. And yet migrant domestic workers' access to public spaces and support is often policed and controlled simultaneously. So turning to the third contribution that I'm going to mention today that I want to highlight and I want to underscore, I'd like to end by underlining Adelle's commitment to the transformative possibilities of utilizing transnational labor law strategically. So in some of my own past research, along with many other feminist anti-colonial scholars, many of us call for an alternative imaginary, thinking about a global labor market membership and indeed global universal caregiving to replace approaches that simply manage the margins. And Adelle's on-the-ground research on the Decent Work for Domestic Workers Convention, I really feel answers a lot of this call by pursuing a global socio-legality. In this instance, using ethnographies to disrupt the assumption that labor protections flow from the global north to the global south via institutions like the ILO. I see everyday transgressions as showing that the ILO itself needs to respond and change in order to not only address the specific issues domestic workers face, but the ways in which dominant labor law protections uphold the law of the household workplace. So a first positive step, in my view, towards the adoption of this transformative agenda is evident in the most forward-looking aspects of Convention 189. And here I'm thinking of Article 14 on Social Security, which addresses the link between servitude and subordination by asserting that domestic workers are to, and here I quote, enjoy conditions that are no less favorable than those applicable to workers generally in respect of Social Security protection, yet, and here I quote again, due regard for the special characteristics of domestic work is to be taken, such that its specificity is recognized while substantively equal conditions are ensured. I'm also thinking of how Article 10 of the instrument, which in addressing the vexed issue of working time, declares all periods when domestic workers, quote, remain at the disposal of the household, end quote, even when they're not engaged in assigned tasks, but on call as waged working time. A very important model. Not to mention how the convention encourages ratifying nations to adopt measures that enable domestic workers to reside outside their employers' households. And at the moment, I'm very much steeped in this struggle, which is facing Canadian agricultural workers who are stuck in employer-provided accommodations with the threat of COVID and have very few places to go. So I see it very much in today's world. A significant move, I think, though, that is to enable domestic workers to reside outside of their employer's household is a significant move given the live-in requirement longstanding in so many countries like my own, which now must rethink these rules in light of provisions to this effect and is doing so. And last but not least, the transformative agenda takes sharp expression in the challenge that the convention makes to methodological nationalism in contrast to other international conventions on particularly and standards on migrant work, by omitting the suggestion that states might create separate rights on the basis of individual domestic workers' migration status. This is a model we should follow. Here, the silences or omissions in the convention and its associated recommendation are just as important as the noises, as Adele recognizes, even though it paradoxically still relies on nation states to implement. It is in these novel ways that the convention is promising, much to the credit of Adele and others, especially those involved in the truly inspiring activism that led to its passage. So I congratulate Adele on such a wonderful contribution to knowledge and action, through this wonderful book.
Thank you so much, Vosko. Let's turn now to Rani Amara. Thank you for joining us from Geneva to speak of the book.
Thanks, Adelle, for having me here. I don't know whether you have me here as an ILO colleague, but I have decided to transgress a bit and not really get into an ILO perspective. But before I go into it, and what I thought is, I really loved the book. I really enjoyed reading it. And what I'm going to do is actually read out some excerpts of the book so that people actually know what it is about. And I think that's the brilliance of this book. So for me, the book Everyday Transgressions, I found it really a brilliant piece of research, and I really thoroughly enjoyed reading it. One of the reasons why I enjoyed reading it was because it actually, I did not expect it. I was a bit hesitant as I was sick when I had to do it. And I was thinking, oh, this is Adele writing this book. It's a legal book. How am I going to actually read and comment upon it? But I was really taken aback at the ease with which you have written this book. It's an amazing masterpiece. And I think what impressed me most was the innovative methodological tools that you use, that of ethnographics, legal texts, and cookbooks to address this complicated question and to provide a beautiful narrative around the issues relating to domestic workers, because this is not new. It's been there for a very long time. And how do you actually navigate through this? And I think you've just done a brilliant job of it. So I'm going to just tell all the listeners basically that this is for everyone to read, not only those from the legal field or ethnography or anthropology or social science, but also domestic workers and activists, and more primarily, anyone who's engaging a domestic worker, which involves probably everyone in the world. So I think it's a very easy book to read in that way, and it brings out and makes you think and question so many aspects. I think that's what is fascinating about the book. And I would say that, I'll go about saying it, but I think the convention is only one step. There's a lot more to be achieved before we can ensure that domestic workers have decent working conditions. So to begin with, the book is actually about the adoption of the ILO Convention 189 on decent work for domestic workers and Recommendation 201, which was undoubtedly a historical milestone for the categories of workers who were invisible at the ILO and who have been overlooked for close to a century. It was also a historical moment because for the first time at the ILO, which is a tripartite setting, you had a group of workers who were actually organized by not the traditional unions, but outside the traditional unions, who were later brought in to the fold. So, it has its historicity even with regard to that, because earlier when certain organizations like SEVA wanted to engage in the informal economy discussions, they could not really engage because they were not part and parcel of the so-called traditional trade unions. So I think it was in that sense also quite a historical movement for the ILO. And I'm very glad that Adelle was part of the process, has actually documented this experience and the historic moment through her personal account. And what is fascinating about the book is the exploration of both the international and the local dynamics in which the state law actually confronts with the law of the household workplace. I just felt hearing Leah Vosko that she has almost said all that I wanted to say, but then I thought, okay, well, I'm bringing in certain stories and certain aspects from my perspective. So that's where we actually compliment. And I think it's quite interesting to see how you bring the law of the household workplace into the narrative. Now, what is the law of the household workplace? I was pretty intrigued about it, actually. I said, what does she mean? What is she trying to say? So I'm going to quote from her book, basically. According to Adelle, the law of the household workplace is historical and contemporary context remind of the so-called labor market informality, which is not the absence of law, but rather the presence of the past and the prevalent but invisible norms and rules that governs the actors in this work relationship. And I think that's central and fundamental to what happens within the household. And she actually builds this up through both ethnographic research and also through cookbooks, which is fascinating to read how this entire law of the household workplace actually develops within her narrative. She further argues that it is critical to understand this law of the household workplace if scholars, policymakers, and social movements are able not to just regulate domestic work, but also change the pluralist and deeply unequal norms. It is similarly critical to pay attention to the conclusion prevalent in several of the studies, which is ambivalent, characterizing the governance of private paid domestic work, which is, according to me, actually the centrality through which you need to actually get into the problem of what is the issue and how do you actually go about trying to regulate something like this. And I think in chapter 2, very rightly there, she brings in this aspect, she gets into this whole discussion about how she does parallels of domestic work with the informal economy. And I cannot but agree with her. Leeds also raised this point that, how there was this entire notion that informal economy would disappear. It is just something that is not there, or it would be thought of as a continuity, but the duality that existed, actually that has been often ignored. There have been studies since the 70s at the ILO2, though it was first set up as part of the World Employment Program in the late 60s and early 70s. Now this entire duality didn't really get absorbed or did not really get its due importance that it should have had, at least as part of the policy making. I think it was always seen as something that is linked to the formal economy, and it was always assumed that it would go away, and we had all the policies being made for the formal sector, ignoring the informal. And I think the problem actually has been there. And she very rightly brings out saying that there are economies very clearly which have dominant informal economy workers or informal sector workers, and those economies actually operate. And productivity might be less, but they do go about operating. That reminds me of my own country, India, where we keep saying where it's 95% unorganized or informal sector workers. What regulates it? Surely the formal laws are not there, but you have very well established social norms, which in some sense actually controls and regulates these economies. And I think even today, we somehow don't seem to be accepting this fact, and we seem to be saying the solution is, okay, let's formalize it, without not necessarily understanding what the formalization process might be, or how do you do it? What does it mean? And I think for me, that's where this book becomes quite interesting to look at. And I like the way, and I think this is something I've always found intriguing. Also, yes, I'm a development economist who's very interested in numbers. So when she tells you that, well, Anne Trebilcock very rightly refers to it as an oxymoron from a strictly legal perspective, I'm like, yes, that's true. There are lots of laws that are there that might be applicable for the informal sector. But I guess we get completely subsumed by this traction for statistically quantifying it and trying to understand what needs to be done. But I think that statistical traction is again what actually got us to get into a discussion about whether it was a homework convention in the 90s or whether it was a domestic worker convention in the last decade. I think one has to give due respect to that, because if you don't have that traction of trying to statistically measure some of these things, it's very difficult to also then try to see what can be done. Because I think I'm often confronted at the ILO by saying that, well, why do you say that informal economy workers are not covered? They are covered by law. They are covered by the conventions. They are covered by everything. But I'm like, but yes, in piecemeal basis, probably, but not in its entirety, which is where the issue actually comes up. I also like the way, Adelle, you bring in to the narrative the entire neoliberal policies and the structural adjustment programs that many countries, especially the developing countries, had to face, and how you put it within the context of the remittances and what it means for the lives of many of the domestic workers or the nurses who had been migrating to other countries. And I think there's one tension that you very clearly engage in within this context is that of a woman as an employer and a worker herself, and the contradiction that exists within there, and the relation of the subordination and servitude as part of it, which is probably has to do with the cookbooks that you refer to later. And I think I'm going to quote some of it from there. And these tensions actually, you can see, not only being there across classes within the global South, but you can also see the tensions between a migrant or an immigrant worker and a native worker within the global North. So, you know, these tensions are there. You talk about it, but you don't really get into that issue because that's not what you want to resolve, or you don't want, I think that's another book to write for you. But I think it's interesting that you bring in this aspect that, you know, it's within the same gender that these, probably that's my reading, further reading to it, that these subordinations and servitudes are existing, even within an economy or within a country and transnationally. And I think it's very important to highlight and engage with this. I think the other richness of the narrative, which basically comes out quite a bit in chapter 1, 2, and 5, if I'm not wrong, is about the variety of actors that are actually involved in this convention, whether it is a domestic worker organization or states or unions or employer representatives or the ILO or the other international players. And I think that for me was quite interesting to see, like, you know, how the entire process goes. And you very rightly bring out some of the aha moments and some of the tough decisions that are there, because there are moments where you thought, well, this is going to be very complicated. We are not going to reach a concession, but that's something that you see that, oh, that's agreed upon in no time without much of a debate, whereas something else that's not very difficult takes quite a number of hours into the late working hours to resolve it. So I think those richness, that richness is very interesting to read. And I also like very nicely the way you relate the literature, which articulates both the national and international labor laws, but you go beyond that and ask what happens when the pluralist law of the household workplace actually intervenes. And I think some of the questions that you raise here for me have been something that I've always asked myself as to, you know, well, you can have national and international labor laws, but are they really powerful enough to counteract what is the law of the household workplace? And similarly, can the formal laws change the informal laws? We don't know. And I think this is something only the time can tell. And to what extent is it possible to transform what you see as a normalized pattern of inequality, which are the underpinnings of the so-called law of the household of the workplace, and how do you actually go about doing it? You, in some sense, try to actually put together all of this in the end of the chapter 3, which basically reminds a reader that, you know, you need to look at domestic workers within not just the existing frameworks, but much more beyond it. And I think this reassertion that you have, for me, is very fundamental and very important, because if you don't do that, then the regulatory frameworks will not be able to actually address the inequality that is there. You very rightly also mention about this. And I think this is where the whole issue comes up, saying that, well, you have the law of the household workplace, to quote you, was rendered more visible by the international standard-setting process led by a collective movement of domestic workers. They recognize that it is easier for workers to negotiate individually and collectively when there are additional transnational levels of support. But I think the issue that emerges as a result of all of this is that you still have the asymmetrical law of the household workplace being there. So how do you actually resolve this issue? And I think you very rightly in some way mentioned in page number 79 that, well, in some sense, the law of the household workplace might persist under the shadows of the state law. And that reminds me of saying that, well, you need to really carefully monitor and to see whether this constant struggle that is going to be there between the so-called normative order and what is in practice and how do you actually rectify it. So I think it reminds in that sense to me that a convention or an international labor law is a step forward, but the work actually begins there in ensuring that it is implemented in a way that it benefits the workers who are targeted. And without a strong implementation mechanism, clearly for me, the asymmetrical law of the household workplace will dominate the international labor law. I think you sort of do get to that point. The last point that I want to make, which has also been referred to by Lee, is the innovative methodologies that you used. I think the 7 ethnographic studies that you've been able to conduct across different regions were actually, they captured so much of the reality and they spoke not just for that region, but they could speak for any reader who's reading it and you could easily relate it. And I think I like the way you brought out the social asymmetries that were there, both with regard to class, race, ethnicity, nationality, the status of migration or gender, and how that interplays with regard to the subordination and the exploitation of domestic workers. And I think these stories are fantastic narrative. The other one, which was, I was very curious, but I had to wait till I reached that chapter, was what was this analysis about the cookbooks? And I think I was super fascinated about it, I have to say. Read that they were the guides on what the rights and duties of the servants are from the late 19th century. And actually, I very clearly can draw parallels to today's digital platform business models, which is said to be the new business model, where again, the entire governance mechanism and the rights and duties of the workers who perform the tasks on the platform are unilaterally determined by platform companies. So there's a very clear, linkage that you see. You see that nothing much has changed since the 19th century to the present in that sense. So I'm just going to rather end by actually reading a passage from your book, which I really loved it. And this has got to do with the British colonial legacy in India. So I think I'd just like to give you this glimpse by quoting from one of the cookbooks that Adelle writes about, giving the duties of mistress and servants, the general management of the house and practical recipes for cooking. And this is actually by Gardiner, and I forget the name, I'm sorry, which was actually addressed to the English girls to whom fate may assign the task of being house mothers in India's foreign strand. And what she means by this is that young housekeepers in India, that is the English ladies in this country, who come to India newly married to begin a new life and to take up new responsibilities under absolutely new conditions, need to know what has to be done. So Adelle actually takes us through these narratives brilliantly, and she writes that the authors of this book offer an unvarnished how to govern the colonial household in India, outlining the duties and responsibilities of mistresses and servants, alongside other such practical matters as keeping the storeroom free of black ants, other insects, preparing appropriate conserve, hosting dinners, and so on. She further says that the detailed enumeration of duties of the overwhelmingly male colonial workers. Actually, what's fascinating is that today's domestic workers are predominantly women. But at the beginning, in the 19th century, under the colonial rule, the majority of the domestic workers were actually, interestingly, males, which is quite a contrast, but there were certain activities that were done by women. Now, again, this is also quite interesting to see, and I don't know to what extent the cookbooks actually go about saying, as to what activities are to be done by men and what is to be done by women. And she further goes about saying that actually the cookbooks further go about deciding what should be the wages in different parts of India, which is like, you know, one would think that the whole minimum wage setting process or the wage setting process would take a kind of a debate or a discussion about setting it up, but this is not what actually happens. So I think I'm going to just leave it there as we're running out of time, but end by saying that the colonial legacy of this book is what the domestic workers are confronted with even today, after 75 years of British rule in India. And the question is, how can the international labor law at the micro level supersede or overcome the law of the household? Thank you very much, Adelle, for this brilliant.
Thank you so much. Really very thoughtful comments. Let's turn now, Louise, if this is working for you. Louise Boivin.
Merci, Adelle. Est-ce que vous m'entendez?
Oui, avec un écho, mais peut-être ça va passer.
Bon, alors, je vais fermer complètement. Je pense que vous m'entendez sans écho. Ça va? Il n'y a pas d'écho?
Oui, là, c'est mieux. Merci.
Bon. Alors, merci beaucoup d'abord, Adelle. Pardon, je viens de fermer, c'est ça. Alors, merci beaucoup, Adelle. C'est un honneur d'avoir été invitée à commenter ce très, très riche ouvrage. Je vais parler en français. I'm sorry, I will talk in French because, anyway, it wouldn't be very interesting if I talk in English. I couldn't translate it, and I was invited to speak French. Merci beaucoup de me permettre de parler français. On fait la traduction, il n'y a pas de souci. Et merci au comité organisateur du congrès et à tous les bénévoles, toutes les personnes qui sont impliquées. Merci à Johanna Westar et Lorenzo Frangi qui ont organisé, qui ont coordonné l'événement, le congrès de ILERA dans des conditions particulières, difficiles. Donc, pour moi, lire ce livre d'Adelle a été extrêmement encourageant et m'a donné de l'espoir dans le présent contexte qui appelle vraiment à des changements structurels majeurs et à la transgression pour nager à contre-courant des puissances économiques, politiques et militaires parce que la pandémie a exacerbé les effets des inégalités sociales. Et elle a mis en lumière le caractère à la fois essentiel du travail de soins, du travail de service, mais aussi le caractère dévalorisé socialement de ce travail de soins, de service, dans lequel sont confinés des groupes sociaux particuliers, en particulier les femmes racisées dans les grandes agglomérations urbaines. Des pays du Nord global. Et donc, ce livre témoigne d'une part d'un processus de construction et d'affirmation dans la sphère politique à plusieurs niveaux, à la fois du local à l'international, d'un pouvoir collectif, la construction, l'affirmation d'un pouvoir collectif qui se construit à la marge, par des travailleuses domestiques dont le travail est au cœur de la reproduction des sociétés du monde entier et au cœur de notre humanité, comme le dit si bien Adelle dans le livre. Donc, ce livre propose d'autre part, à mon avis, un changement de paradigme, un changement de conception, à la fois de ce qui est le travail et de ce que sont les normes qui régissent le travail. Et troisièmement, de qui sont les acteurs, les actrices qui peuvent agir collectivement dans la société concernant le travail et produire du droit. et comment on peut produire du droit, où il est possible d'agir collectivement pour les travailleuses et les travailleurs. Donc, Adelle a joué un rôle fondamental dans le processus de construction, à la fois sur le plan institutionnel et sur le plan intellectuel. Et ce livre, en fait, témoigne est un généreux cadeau, en fait, pour qu'on puisse comprendre explicitement comment s'est construit, comment s'est fait ce processus à la fois institutionnel et intellectuel. Donc, je voudrais présenter 2 commentaires. Le premier très général sur la richesse de l'ouvrage pour l'apprentissage collectif, comme chercheur, pour nos étudiants et étudiantes aussi, mais aussi pour le travail de contestation des fondements des injustices sociales. Et je voudrais aussi parler le second commentaire porte sur le changement de paradigme que le livre propose sur les 3 aspects que j'ai indiqués, donc le travail, les normes du travail et les acteurs, actrices et les lieux de l'action collective. Je remercie beaucoup Adelle qui présente, qui traduit en même temps que je parle. Merci beaucoup. Je sais que c'est difficile à faire. Je suis désolée. Alors, voilà. Donc, pour le premier commentaire, bon, je vais juste partager un extrait à l'écran parce qu'il me semble important. Donc, c'est un livre pour l'apprentissage collectif et pour l'apprentissage du travail de contestation des injustices sociales. Et un extrait, Understanding is a first step to identifying what must and can be changed, keeping it in motion and unsettling it. Apprendre d'abord, comprendre d'abord. Et je pense que le premier élément, c'est la richesse de l'ouvrage sur le plan, d'abord, pour moi, éthique, parce que, comme chercheur, Adelle affirme sa subjectivité, son inscription dans une communauté, dans une histoire, dans un héritage aussi social, familial, et affirme aussi une volonté de contribuer à changer la narration, à changer les conceptions, comme elle l'explique notamment dans la postface du livre. Et aussi, sur le plan éthique et épistémologique, tout au long du livre, il y a cette reconnaissance que les savoirs ne sont pas que les savoirs universitaires, scientifiques, mais aussi les savoirs populaires, les savoirs des travailleuses domestiques qui sont au cœur, qui sont toujours présentes dans l'ouvrage et pour lesquelles est exprimé un profond respect de la chercheure. Elles ne sont jamais des objets de recherche, ce sont des sujets et des productrices de savoir, en plus d'être productrices de droit. Donc, on sent cet immense respect pour ce que ces travailleuses ont à nous apprendre sur le plan intellectuel et sur le plan sociétal, sur le plan de l'action collective. Donc, on parle de leur résistance individuelle et collective qui sont liées de l'individu au collectif et le rouage des changements de conception sur le plan intellectuel et des changements institutionnels. Donc, à la fois dans les foyers et jusque dans la sphère internationale et même transnationalement. Donc, c'est vraiment très stimulant comme ancrage intellectuel. Pardon. Sur le plan scientifique aussi, la transdisciplinarité sur laquelle s'appuie l'ouvrage est inspirante et puissante. À la fois le droit positif, mais bien sûr comme référence pour le critiquer, pour le recréer, refonder, mais aussi une sociologie du droit du travail, la sociologie des rapports sociaux racisés, de l'histoire aussi de ces rapports sociaux racisés dans laquelle ils sont ancrés, de toutes les imbrications en différents types de rapports sociaux, donc une sociologie historique, et donc comment la sociologie du droit aussi, comment se créent les normes juridiques et les normes sociales, donc dans cette interlégalité, internormativité, et en même temps comment l'histoire, l'héritage historique des rapports de servitude propres à l'esclavage qui se conjuguent à l'histoire des normes de genre aussi, pour comprendre aujourd'hui et mieux envisager demain. Donc, c'est très riche sur le plan et je trouve que c'est pour nos étudiants et nos étudiantes aussi, ça couvre un large spectre de champs d'études et ça permet de comprendre comment ou même la transdisciplinarité peut être vraiment puissante pour l'analyse. Et sur le plan méthodologique, bon, mes collègues avec qui j'ai l'honneur de participer aujourd'hui, Uma et Leah, ont parlé de la richesse méthodologique, la diversité des méthodologies utilisées, évidemment, et aussi, bon, comment dire, toutes les études et les pratiques qui sont étudiées, qui sont reprises, mais à partir de beaucoup de la perspective du Sud global. Au lieu de faire un droit, de transposer un droit qui a été érigé en fonction de la norme industrielle du Nord, des pays du Nord, et coloniale ou néocoloniale, on part d'abord des pays du Sud et de prime abord avec l'expérience de l'Afrique du Sud post-apartheid pour repenser une norme d'une façon transnationale. Et donc, des normes d'une façon transnationale. Donc, c'est très inspirant aussi et ça nous oblige à remettre en question les positions qu'on peut avoir, la posture, l'ancrage qu'on peut avoir comme chercheur du Nord et qui bénéficient de privilèges blancs, qui se retrouvent dans des positions de domination à certains égards dans les rapports sociaux. Et donc, ça nous oblige à nous ouvrir et à changer, à nous ouvrir à d'autres postures, d'autres positions et d'autres savoirs. La deuxième partie du livre, et je vais mettre un extrait, je vais essayer à nouveau de vous partager un extrait. Alors, je m'excuse. J'ai un petit peu de problème parfois. Voilà. Donc, la deuxième partie de l'ouvrage, pas de l'ouvrage, mais de mon allocution, porte sur le changement de paradigme. C'est un livre pour changer de paradigme. Donc, le lieu de travail domestique, qui est présumé atypique, en fait, c'est un des lieux de travail parmi une série d'autres lieux de travail où des normes sociales sont imposées. Et à partir de l'expérience des travailleuses domestiques, leur savoir et leur résistance, on peut parler du travail et des changements de paradigme nécessaires pour un paquet d'autres lieux de travail. Et aussi, cet extrait « Decent work for domestic work must challenge the racialized segmentation of the work » dans l'entièreté des formes de travail, on retrouve beaucoup cette racialisation, ces formes de hiérarchisation basées sur la racialisation, aussi sur d'autres types de rapports d'oppression, comme les rapports de genre. Et le livre appelle à revoir ces hiérarchies, ces segmentations. Je voudrais juste revenir. Alors, le livre propose en quelque sorte un changement de paradigme au sujet de ce qu'est le travail, de ce que sont les normes qui régissent le travail, de qui sont les acteurs, les actrices qui peuvent agir collectivement, où on peut agir, comment on peut agir collectivement pour changer le paradigme, changer le travail. Donc, d'abord, qu'est-ce que le travail? Le travail, à partir de la perspective des travailleuses domestiques du monde entier, n'est pas le travail défini selon le modèle traditionnel eurocentré, des relations centrées en tout cas dans le nord de la planète, des relations industrielles, du pourvoyeur masculin, blanc, natif du pays, de relations de travail dans l'entreprise, dans l'usine, à partir du lieu de travail domestique. Les travailleuses mettent en lumière un lieu où se retrouve tout un travail invisibilisé, mais un travail aussi invisibilisé qui existe dans beaucoup d'autres secteurs d'activité et qui tend à s'étendre, il me semble, et je pense que Ouma disait la même chose, en fait, c'est avec les nouvelles formes de marchandisation et les plateformes numériques. Donc, on a beaucoup à apprendre à partir de la perspective sur le lieu de travail domestique et des normes. Deuxièmement, donc, on apprend beaucoup sur ces normes sociales, la loi du travail, du lieu de travail domestique, comme le dit Adelle. Donc, il ne s'agit pas, dit-elle, de mettre seulement fin à l'informalité, à formaliser les normes par l'encadrement juridique. Il faut aller au-delà de l'action de l'État, examiner d'autres sources de lois, donc les lois du lieu de travail, qui sont des lois, il faut donc s'y attarder, il faut porter attention, comme elle nous y invite, pour voir comment ces lois ont plus à voir avec la servitude qui est persistante, héritée de l'esclavage, plutôt qu'avec les lois du travail, d'une relation de travail classique qu'on enseigne, qui nous est enseignée, qui est la base du droit du travail traditionnel, si on peut dire. Donc, le travail domestique n'est pas le seul site où ces normes persistent, nous dit Adelle, et avec cette exigence de disponibilité permanente, par exemple, dans le lieu de travail domestique, et cette absence de frontières entre le temps de travail et le temps personnel, entre l'espace de travail et l'espace personnel, bien, ces normes tendent à s'étendre non seulement à tout le secteur du travail de care, de soins, avec la privatisation, le retrait de l'État social, mais de plus en plus à d'autres catégories de travailleurs, travailleuses, avec la remarchandisation du travail, comme Ouma le disait, notamment avec les plateformes numériques et aussi l'instrumentalisation de la COVID, de la pandémie et du confinement pour remarchandiser le travail, ramener des normes qui ont plus à voir avec la servitude et que les travailleuses domestiques ont mis en lumière. Donc, enfin, le troisième élément de changement de paradigme qui me semble ressortir de ce livre, c'est quels sont les acteurs, les actrices sociales qui peuvent agir collectivement pour produire du droit et où est-ce qu'il est possible d'agir et comment il est possible d'agir collectivement. Et les transgressions des travailleuses domestiques de chaque jour au quotidien dans le lieu de travail domestique jusqu'aux transgressions dans la sphère internationale où elles ont voulu être visibles et aussi entendues, eh bien, ces transgressions-là ouvrent la porte pour d'autres transgressions contre les injustices sociales dans la sphère du travail. Et tous les moyens d'action qu'elles ont pris, comme des campagnes publiques, que ce soit individuelles dans la résistance individuelle et collective, mais aussi les campagnes publiques les multiples formes de transgression qu'elles ont déployées appellent à d'autres transgressions, mais aussi à sortir de on dit out of the box, à sortir du cadre très étroit des relations industrielles. Nous sommes dans un congrès de relations industrielles, labor management, labor relations. Donc, elle réinvente l'unité d'accréditation parce que le modèle traditionnel des relations de travail et du droit du travail les confine à une unité d'accréditation où elles sont seules, c'est-à-dire le foyer avec un employeur. Et alors, elle transforme cette unité d'accréditation par la transgression individuelle, collective, par l'action collective. Elle le transforme en une unité d'accréditation transnationale, en quelque sorte. Elles ouvrent les possibilités de l'action collective au-delà de l'action syndicale, de la négociation collective dans une unité d'accréditation auprès d'un employeur individuel, mais elle nous force à repenser l'action collective, les lieux de l'action collective du niveau local jusqu'au niveau transnational et à repenser en fait l'unité d'accréditation d'abord en termes de lieux de solidarité et non pas une simple catégorie juridique. Donc, c'est vraiment, Adelle met en valeur et elle participe aussi elle a participé tout au long de ce processus de changement institutionnel et intellectuel avec les travailleuses domestiques à proposer d'ouvrir les espaces pour la contestation et aussi la réflexion. Alors, c'est un livre qui est vraiment très, très, très riche. Et je remercie beaucoup Adelle pour avoir eu la générosité de partager son expérience, ses savoirs et ceux des travailleuses domestiques du monde entier. Merci pour l'invitation. Je suis très honorée.
Merci infiniment, Louise. C'était extrêmement, extrêmement passionnant. Merci pour ces commentaires et de les avoir livrés si clairement. I hope that folks were able to follow, hopefully originally, but if not, via the chat. And now I'm delighted to turn over to our fourth speaker, Ana Virginia Gomes, who is joining us from Brazil. So thank you very much for being with us, and we look forward to your comments.
Thank you, Adele, and hi, everybody. I wish I could speak in Portuguese also, but I'll speak in English. Adele, the book is just wonderful, and everybody has said so much about it, and that I will bring a more personal and local approach. I think the first thing that called my attention is that it's a book that talks about domestic work, but it could be a book talking about Brazilian domestic work by a Brazilian. You know, so much you wrote brought to me experiences, and not only academics, because as a Brazilian, I have been living with domestic workers my whole life. They are part of my life, of my family life, by everyday life in Brazil. And now, as a labor law professor, what called my attention was the idea that has been taught here of the law of the household workplace and the pluralist approach towards labor law that really tells the story how labor law is not enough, and in a way it reinforces the exclusion of domestic workers, not only domestic workers, but also other types of informal workers. And I will start this by telling a story that has happened this month of June here in Brazil, and that unfortunately it fits very well with what you described in your book. So in the beginning of June, a child fell from a building in Recife, which is a big town in Northeast Brazil. That was the story on the news. Then on the next day, we learned that this child was the son of a domestic worker in that apartment. And what had happened was that the domestic worker went downstairs to walk the dog of the family and let the child playing with the employer's child under the care of the employer. So the boy, he wanted to go and look for his mom, and that was the apartment had only one elevator, was very rich family. And he tried once and the employer brought him back. Then he tried again. He was 5 years old. Then the employer let him go. And not only that, we could see by the recording in the elevator, she pressed many buttons upstairs. So the elevator went upstairs with a 5-year-old child. And the first time it opened, he left. On the 9th floor, he found a window that was open for air conditions and he fell. Now the employer was arrested and she was accused of manslaughter as there was no intention. And she paid like $6,000 and will respond. She paid the $6,000 to get out of jail, to be free during the investigations. This story has shocked the country, and what led me asking myself was what was happening there. And in a way, you know, your report, your analysis explains a lot that in that workplace, she was a formal domestic worker, but it was not only labor law that was ruling that relationship. There was also the law on the workplace there that was regulating their relationship. That employer, that woman, she did not see that kid as a child and did not see the domestic worker as a person, because otherwise she would never let that child alone in an elevator and even pressing higher floors. So for her, they were invisible. It was like she was the lady and they were her objects, her property, that she could not see any humanity there. So this very sad and extreme case show us the reality of domestic work and how even in formal relationships, the labor law just does not explain everything, and it's not enough to solve or to cover all the problems, the exploitations, the violations in their dignity that domestic workers suffer. So one point that really struck to me, and I will cite here, that you wrote, "You do not know or even see me or my word, but you think you know my place in your word," is this idea of invisibility that was very, very clear in this case. So for us to really understand domestic work regulation, it's necessary to have a pluralistic approach to it and to see how in that situation there are many different set of rules working and applying to it. And some of them are not part of this formal, valid labor law order at all, but they many times they are more, they are stronger than the formal law that exists. And then, you also wrote in your book that to understand, sometimes in the labor law narrative, there is this very neat separation between free and unfree labor. Like there is also a very neat narrative about formal and informal, as these type of works were totally separated from each other. Then when we look at reality, there is no such separation. So taking again the case of Brazil, Brazil went through 300 years of slavery. Then slavery was abolished in 1888. 40 years after that, labor law started to be built. It was totally transplanted from Europe because we're not even industrialized yet. So it was very clear that it could not really be effective or cover everybody. At that point, already a huge part of the population, it's not that they were excluded, they had never been included. And from the beginning, it had a very clear racial exclusion, because when slavery was abolished, there was no concern, policy, compensation, nothing for the workers who were set free. So, and this is, it's very, we can see this very clear in the case of domestic workers and the Black women who just continue to work many times in the same kind of conditions. So in this case, for example, we see how to truly understand what was going through the mind of this person, we have to go back and see how this slavery mindset is still present. And again, if the labor law does not include the racism element on the structure of its regulation, we'll just not reach many questions that for which labor law has just no answer. You also, and that's what I found very, very interesting. You wrote that the weight of the past on the present in domestic work governance, and we should look at the everyday law of the household workplace, because only understanding it, we can challenge. And what I feel is that with this formalistic view, we kind of throw everything that it doesn't fit in any way in the informal market. And so many groups are being excluded that it has now become a problem. But I always think kind of ironic how some workers were always there and it was not a problem before. As it is the case of domestic workers. So we are having here also in Brazil a lot of discussion about Uber drivers, platform workers, and how there is this new workplace. But domestic workers are part of this very old workplace that also did not fit. And then not only domestic workers, we study here many other informal excluded workers who could also not fit to the labor law workplace. And the, you know, the view that you propose, it helps to create a narrative from labor law that is able to include these workers. But from, again, from looking from here, we should also be aware and care to create our own narrative this time. And not only discuss informal work and the future of labor law from the point of view of these new informal workers who have been excluded because of digital transformation. So the changes did not come, or the exclusions did not come, because now we have Uber drivers, platform workers. Here in Brazil, as in many other countries, a big part of the labor force has never been included. So how are we going to be able to have a labor law that it's really inclusive to everybody? In your book, it raised all the questions that, many of the questions that we should ask ourselves. And I think the most important one is this, is the idea that in the structure of the regulation, the element, the fight against racism should be present. Because otherwise the law is not enough to change the material conditions that make the exploitation still alive. And one very important thing that I bring from your book is the idea that labor law cannot be seen in an isolated body of law. So for the regulation to be effective, we should try to build policies and regulations that also reach other parcels of people's life, and they make them so vulnerable to exploitation, to discrimination. Next year will be 11 years of Convention 189, and Brazil has started regulating domestic work with the goal to recognize the same rights as other employees since 1988. When the Constitution, Brazilian Constitution, recognized many fundamental rights to domestic workers. Since then, we have been guaranteeing more and more rights. And now we are in 2020, and something like this happens, which is very extreme, but it's not so an isolated situation. So the question is there, how to make this type of regulation more effective, what labor law needs to do. And I think your book is a huge contribution on this. Labor law has to make links with education, regulations, and policies. So poor Black girls have other opportunities. We have in Brazil more than 6 million domestic workers. I will tell you that maybe 1% has the vocation to care and to take care of people. 99%, they are there because they have no other opportunity. Until we have this amount of women at disposal and offering informal work that it's kind of a informal subsidy for the lack of state action on care, on family responsibilities, it will be very hard for a labor law to change the reality of domestic worker. And I will end now. You also say that, talking about South Africa, that the state was not absent. And that's so true also in Brazil. When we think that for so many years there was no labor law regulation on or recognition of employment rights, we could think that state was not there. State was there, and it is there, maintaining this situation where care is just a responsibility of women, and women will solve this through the availability of cheap informal domestic work made available by poor women who have no other opportunity. So the state was there, law was there, supporting this system. After like 10 years of regulating domestic work, I think your book shows us that this is totally not enough. And thank you so much, Adele, and thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much, Ana Virginia. Thank you, everyone. The comments are just so rich. and you know, putting together a panel that's this interdisciplinary, economists, feminist political economy, industrial relations, and labor law. I think so much of what you had to say converged and really offered a lot of richness. I will not respond to the individual comments. I think that in our remaining 10-ish minutes, I'd like to hear from those who are present, might have questions for any of the panelists about what's been said. So over to you. I will see if there are any questions in the in the chat. Heat waves. Gregor, do you have a question? There might be other questions coming forward, so please feel free. And panelists, of course, with each other. Dion, do I see your hand coming up? Fabulous.
So I have to just say I'm just blown away by this panel. There's so many things going through my mind. But I have actually a specific question, maybe Adele, and I just ordered your book. It's coming Sunday, so I'm just so excited to read it. My question is about, I've been thinking a lot about sort of policy around sort of especially the gendered, and now I'm learning increasingly more, and I knew this, but it's becoming increasingly prominent for me, racialized nature of domestic work. And one of the policy sort of approaches that I've been thinking a lot about is the basic income. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about that in relation to the law, or if you think that that actually could provide sort of this alternative option for people, especially domestic workers, to be able to say no to substandard work, or you know, to have an outside option in this. Do you see that as a possible solution, or as a possible complementary approach to the law?
Thanks for that question. It's a really important one, and I'll just say off the bat that in particular, Ana Virginia might want to speak to the Brazilian experience, where UBI has been introduced and seemed, at least for some time, to be leading at least to the ability for domestic workers to choose what kind of conditions they would take. And there's some commentary about how much resistance that created. So, you know, UBI, there's very good work out and some interesting pilot projects in different parts of the world, including in Ontario, about where one might go. And so much depends on how one conceptualizes the state and state responsibility. Is UBI being seen as a replacement, or is it a complementary part of the package to address to address a floor? How universal is UBI? Where are we going with it? What are the kinds of considerations that are being taken into place? There's a, you know, and you can tell already by my initial comments that there's a very right-wing version of UBI, which would simply be out goes the state, in comes the, you know, a check of a denomination that probably won't radically change people's lives. So there's room for caution, and it's led to my own desire to be really attentive to the kind of policy origins and policy spaces that UBI is taking us in. I think our current moment, though, gives real pause as we think about COVID-19 and what it's meant to be actually putting secure amount of cash in people's hands so that they can maintain a certain quality of life. And then to think radically about what that would have meant if we were not simply sacrificing those racialized bodies who are now called essential workers and called upon to be out there, and who are the ones who actually have less choice on whether to have those resources. So you can see how, when we design policy measures that are meant to be responsive, we've actually got to be thinking about whether we are reinforcing particular forms of historic subordination or creating the conditions for the liberation of people who are stuck in those places. So there's no magic solution, but I do think we have a responsibility to think very seriously about what it means to discourage the paternalistic or maternalistic state, and create enabling conditions that are actually supportive of challenging subordination, right? So there's a very clear state role for that. The last thing I'll say about that is I wanted to take very seriously the fact that the ILO in its future work report and increasingly it wanted not to let go of the link to work. Right? But I think, and so there's a kernel of insight in that I'm inclined to share, but to just posit that without thinking about labor market segmentation is just it reinforces the problem, right? And we're seeing similar things around the various proposals around jobs and guarantees. If we're not dealing with the subordination, we're going to find ourselves in very similar ways. So, Anna, Virginie, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I did want to open the opportunity if you wanted to have something to say, and of course, anyone else.
Oh, I agree with you that it's not a magical solution. It has to be integrated with other types of policies. And in developing countries, this income is barely for surviving. So it doesn't reach, for example, low-paid workers because they are above that.
Thank you. Anyone else want to comment on that? Yes, Uma, of course, yes.
I think that's a very good question and rightly put, and I think you handled it, you actually responded to it very well. I just want to add one more point to it. I think UBI in its actual form had very good intentions when it came up in the 80s and all of it. But the technological push that it got in the last decade, that's what is super worrying, saying that can the welfare state be replaced by UBI? And I think that's where the tensions and that's where the problem is. And that's reason rightly how Adelle put it, saying the Future of Work Commission very clearly takes its stand saying it has to be employment led. I think, giving an opportunity to workers to say, okay, I do not want low paid jobs. And so UBI can come in. Now that is something it will work if there are a number of employment opportunities that are there, so that a worker can choose over a period of time what he or she wants. But given that that is not happening, and increasingly we see piecemeal neoliberal measures, welfare measures of, digging the roads and filling it up happening more and more, I think what we need today is a very clear, concerted employment policy linked to the industrial policy. This is, I'm sorry, but we are going back to the 80s and the 90s, before the neoliberal era came, where you had very clear planning and industrial policies. I think one needs to relook at that and to see, well, you have the educated masses coming out. Is that educated masses absorbable by the market today? And there's a huge skills gap that is there. So I think if you sort of can address the employment, industrial policy, skill policy arena, and then link it to the UBI and say that, well, don't subsidize the employers, please. Let's not subsidize them. They have the profits, they can pay. I think you need to find a level playing field where you say, fine, okay, there are the conditions where these workers' wages are the way it is. Can then the state come in to provide other benefits? If that's the way it's conceived and thought about, I think UBI might be a very good way to go about it. And I think rightly how Adelle said about the COVID-19. Now, COVID-19 was a fantastic situation where the states could have easily come up and say, essential workers also get UBI. It's not just for those who cannot get jobs, but it is for everyone, because it was a huge hazard pay that you had to pay, because these workers were fully exposed to the virus, and they don't even have resources to actually get medical aid. So, you know, UBI could have been used very ingeniously and innovatively for this particular purpose. So I think it's much more about thinking how to come up with using it in an innovative way. Thanks.
Thank you. Very thoughtful. Other comments on that?
Christopher raised his hand. Christopher,
Great.
You want to ask your question?
Sure.
Yeah, so I actually wanted to take it back to a different topic. I have not read Adelle's book yet, but now I will. But I was very excited to hear from Uma and Leah this idea that informality is not the absence of law, but the presence of customary and traditional law. And in the United States, for obvious reasons, we've been thinking a lot about the influence of racism in lots of parts of society. And I think you could argue that, in fact, there's dimensions of customary law, particularly racial and gender subordination, that apply not just in informal workplaces, but in formal workplaces as well. And so if you start thinking about sort of multiple bodies of law, where you've got customary law, organizational law, and then state law, first of all, you quickly come to the point that Leah and others have emphasized, that the standard employment relationship is the atypical work. But secondly, it's saying there is this sort of universal law, and let's call it a law. That's the nice thing about having a book by a law scholar. Let's call it law that actually is regulating all work relationships, and that might be a good starting point. So I just wondering what you think of that way of stretching what you're saying, or maybe you've already stretched it that far.
Thanks, Chris. So yeah, law is everywhere.
Footnote that.
Go ahead, Lee.
Just because Adele and I were on a panel yesterday where we talked a fair bit about questions of subsistence and all this discussion about work and work relations and thinking about the land that we inhabit on Turtle Island. There's also that really deep question about, and it pertains to UBI too, about how the extent to, or how far work relations stretch. So listening to all of this before Chris spoke and others, it occurred to me that that might be something that Adele would want to reflect on.
Well, thanks. So I'll reflect quickly, seeing the time and seeing your patience with this, but they're both very helpful insights. And yes, my subject focus was domestic work and the, binary that we erect around it as, either informal or formal, and, and so I do a bit of a play, which Uma picked up on, with the, at once, from a legal categorization, you've got a problem, but, don't reify the legal categorization. So yes, do we have pluralist frameworks emerging out of the customary? Is slavery part of the customary? Absolutely. Why would it end at a workplace because it's a home as opposed to a shop floor, right? We know this, and we've translated it into a law against discrimination and then pummeled the life out of what we mean by anti-discrimination, particularly in US jurisprudence, but Canadian jurisprudence, or rather the reception of Canadian jurisprudence, is sometimes deeply troubling as well, so that we actually sidestep what it is we think we're dealing with, right? Because we understand discrimination then as the exception rather than as a competing legality. The contemporary ability, at least, to even say the words white supremacy, as terrifying as that is, right? But its visibility now says that maybe we can start to have different kinds of conversations. Right? So a short version of a much bigger question, but the answer is yes, deeply thinking about that. Yes, part of that comes through the book. And yes, it's, I think, a bigger project for many of us in this moment. Yeah. So, folks, I tremendous gratitude for your engagement with these ideas, with the work. Thank you to the panelists for pouring so much of yourselves into the commentary, and for all those in attendance for your reflections and presence. And look forward to more engagements with all of you about these themes. So thank you. Goodbye.